hope we're off to something that's really going to be very enjoyable and very educational for our community. Judy Preston presented a course to the Connecticut Master Gardeners, of which I am a member, and she is also a Connecticut Master Gardener. And she gives a course called the Coastal Certificate, in which we spend time exploring what's happening to Long Island Sound and what we might do to make better things happen to Long Island Sound. And so we invited her to be our first speaker in this lecture series. She will tell you more about her background and her preparation for this interesting work she's doing. And I'm happy to welcome Judy Preston. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to be speaking to you tonight. I'm going to give you just the short version of a little about my background for the context of this talk, which is my training, my academic training is as an ecologist, as a naturalist really, which is a passion of mine, but my real passion is gardening and the intersection of ecology and gardens. I've lived in my home for 20 years and I have been studying and cataloging and trying to put some order into my garden, and then the ecologist in me talks back and says there's only so much order that nature really wants to do. So it's a really interesting way of looking at landscapes, and that has always interested me and is part of why I'm here before you tonight, because of my interest in the environment and particularly connections between land and ocean, land and sea, there's so much that goes on between those two. I'm also a coastal resident. I live in the town of Old Saybrook in Connecticut, which is at the mouth of the Connecticut River. It's quite a ways east from here, but we have a lot of the same issues and a lot of the same questions about what's going on with Long Island Sound. And what I'd like to do, actually I do want to also say that I am a real believer in community-based conservation. I ran a nonprofit for about 10 years, working with the communities in the lower Connecticut River on issues, all kinds of issues, land protection, pollution issues, working as a person with a bunch of other people. We have a little bit different form of government in Connecticut than you do. We're all volunteer. Every town, 169 towns in Connecticut, we all have volunteer commissions, wetlands and conservation and zoning and planning. So all of that happens at a local level, all by volunteers. There's turnover. It's a very challenging form of local government, and I've always said that it's sort of the very worst and the very best of your neighbors is what happens at the local level. And somehow, great things happen as a result of it. So it's part of all of my interest in what I'm talking to you tonight comes out of this scene where the lion's share of work that really gets done happens at the local level, because it's people talking to people and people who are passionate like yourselves. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is a little bit about the context of what the issues are in Long Island Sound and how did we get there? And some of that's going to be just the history of lawns in particular, which is fascinating. I could spend a whole evening, in fact I did in the Coastal Certificate, talking about lawn history, because it's really a very interesting thing. And then talk about some solutions. What's sound gardening look like if we were really to apply some of this? This is not an effort to say you have to do this. It is like myself exploring in my own backyard, saying, what are a couple of things that I could do that would make this better, that would make me feel better about my relationship to nature and particularly to Long Island Sound. So we're going to be looking at water quality, and we're going to look at life in Long Island Sound. So let's start the story with the intersection between land and sea, in this case inland and Long Island Sound. It's a very important relationship, and you may have heard of watersheds, drainage basins, tributaries. All of this is a way of describing all of the water that is contributed into Long Island Sound. And it's important because a watershed is an area that's usually defined by elevation, and all of the streams that drain one stream to another stream to progressively more streams until they're all coming into the main stem of whatever river system, whether that's the Connecticut River or it's your local river here in town, all are emptying at the same point into the sea. That's the definition of a watershed. what happens up in this area is critically important to Long Island Sound, to any place where a river meets the coast, because there are a lot of resources that are coming out of this forested landscape or urban landscape. It includes resources, biological resources, mineral resources, and the other part to keep in mind is that it's not just a one-way contribution. The watershed for Long Island Sound is huge, really. It goes all the way to the Canadian border. If you look at the Connecticut River, 410 miles to the north, it captures water that ultimately makes it to Long Island Sound. So the large majority of fresh water that's actually making Long Island Sound an estuary is coming from the Connecticut River. So we have multiple states that are actually contributing. So there's a huge relationship between what's being drained off the landscape, but there's also an important relationship between how the ocean contributes. I see this all the time on the Connecticut River because it's tidal. Twice a day, the tide brings in nutrients and resources, and in some cases it brings migratory species. We're lucky to have a whole suite of migratory fish that will spend the lion's share of their life in deep ocean habitats and come back into our coastal rivers to spawn. That's true also of the American eel, except it does just the opposite. It will spend the lion's share of its life in our upland watersheds and then turn around as a mature silver eel, which can be up to 3 feet long, and head out of Long Island Sound, go down to the Sargasso Sea, which is off the coast of Florida, which is where all of the world's eels go, reproduce, and then what's amazing is the relationship between these small silver eels, which are the young, will drift in currents for a while, but then they have in their ganglia the understanding, some people think it's actually a sense of smell, but they will come back to the places where the parent left from. All of these relationships that are not just what's happening on land or even just in our Long Island Sound area, but actually taking into account resources that are much further away. Same thing with the osprey that has now taken off. Always sad to see them go at the end of the season. And some of these will go down as far as Patagonia, and we will anxiously await. In my neck of the woods, it's about March 21st. Not that we're counting, but March 21st is usually when we hope and expect to see, and often do, the ospreys returning. So these relationships, there's a fascinating relationship between freshwater mussels and migratory fish. So this is an ocean-dwelling fish. This is blueback herring and the alewife, spending most of the time in the ocean, coming back into our upper areas to spawn. But there are also the means by which this species, mussels, freshwater mussels, get around. You might think if you've ever seen a freshwater mussel, they don't move very fast, and you have to wonder, how on earth does that get anywhere when it's only traveling a very slow pace? It's a brilliant plan. The young will be ejected into the water column. The migratory fish will pick up, not actively, but the Glaucidia, the young of this, will find its way to the gills of these fish. And that's their taxi ride to the next. When they're mature, they're taking advantage of this fish bringing in filter feeding, and then when it is mature enough and a very tiny replica of its adult, it will drop out of the water column and establish a new colony. What's really interesting about this story is that if these fish disappear, then these disappear. And some of these have really tight relationships, like only one mussel is known to one particular fish. Otherwise, there's multiple shared. So there's lots of things going on. We live on the land, but we are intimately related to what we do on the land has a tremendous impact to what happens in Long Island Sound. So Long Island Sound is an estuary. The definition of an estuary, partially enclosed area where fresh water comes into a body of salt water. It's usually defined by the amount of salinity. So, south of Montauk, you might find 35 parts per thousand of salt. By the time you get into Long Island Sound, 27 parts per thousand. By the time you are traveling up the Connecticut River, we get down to 20 to 18. And of course, the tide is going far north in our bigger rivers, so that salt becomes an influence going up rivers as well as down river flow. The importance and why we we focus on estuaries. Why they're so important is because they're home to a tremendous concentration of life forms. 75% of our commercial catch, 80 to 90% of our recreational catch, and a whole suite of what are called ecosystem services. So those things like during our last couple of great storms, Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Irene, those people that had the benefit of the natural storm buffer provided by intact marshes along the coasts of Long Island Sound fared better than those who had hardened their shorelines. So a lot of these, we increasingly focus on what are the habitat benefits of keeping a healthy Long Island Sound. So here we have the image of Long Island Sound. It is an estuary of national significance. It was one of the first to be designated in this country. Our Congress, recognizing the importance of this system, and particularly because of its relationship, its productivity, but its relationship to the urban centers and incredible human populations that are within short distance of this. You know, there are 23 million people, and I'm sure that that number continues to go up within 50 miles of Long Island Sound. That's both a great opportunity because it's a great opportunity to get people to understand the importance of estuaries. It is also part of what the greatest challenge is in terms of the inputs, and particularly sewage input, as you can imagine, with that many people. 600 miles of coastline. It's a shallow area, on average 63, 65 feet deep, which means that the sunlight that's coming onto that surface is helping to contribute to the productivity, the beginning of the food chain in Long Island Sound. So 1,200 species of invertebrates, that includes all those great things that we eat, the shellfish, 170 species of fish, 50 of those spawn in Long Island Sound. And this time of year, after we've seen the migrants leave, we understand the quiet around after a lot of our migratory species. But we have this incredible concentration in the spring of all these birds coming back and using our coastal areas.
Judy, is it the space between the North Fork and the South Fork, is that also an estuary?
By definition, it probably is. Yeah.
Baconic Bay.
It's Baconic.
Also one of the national estuaries.
Yes, yes, that's true. So, life in Long Island Sound. I was just talking to Ernie. It's about, he probably knows better than anyone what the life in Long Island Sound is, having a camera that he can put over his boat. But all of these organisms are representative of some of the really interesting species that most of us will never see. We don't have the advantage of either being out on a boat or having a camera to put over the side. Really incredible. I got this image from a young researcher at Southern Connecticut State University who was studying this northern cup coral, but she photographed this in Long Island Sound. All of these incredible organisms, and eelgrass, which you might not think is any big deal. It's basically just like a meadow underwater, but these actually become incredibly important indicators of the health of our ecosystem at the near shore because of the importance of all the species that use this like a garden or a protected area. So a lot of our marsh, near-shore marsh areas provide habitat and particularly, most importantly, protection for species. So the young nurseries, fish, are using those places. Kelp. And in particular, although the color's not showing as much as it should, this is actually an orange. It's a very pretty, this is an anemone, and it is a northern anemone, but it looks very tropical, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So, in order to talk about what our living on the land contributes to a place like Long Island Sound, we really have to think about some really unsexy things to talk about. Stormwater, non-point source pollution. It's really tough to get people engaged and excited about those two things. But Hurricane Irene in 2011 was actually a really good illustration of watersheds and what happens when you get a lot of disturbance and how does a watershed contribute to what comes off of the land and into an ocean system. And in this case, we all saw the photographs, all the images of these poor people in Vermont who were really beat up by Hurricane Irene, which really glanced, at least in my neck of the woods in Saybrook, kind of glanced our coast there, but really went up the Hudson and just sat over Vermont for a number of days. So they were torn up pretty badly, some intense flooding, but what was really interesting was NASA took a photograph of, for a couple of weeks, there was this extraordinary plume of sediment that came down the Connecticut River. Now the Connecticut River goes up into Vermont, and there's a certain part of the watershed of Connecticut River that goes through the areas that were hit and damaged. You can see where there would have been a lot of sediment that was made available to the Connecticut River. So I live right here, and for all the mornings that I would drive over the bridge on the Connecticut and look down and see this roiling, muddy with docks and tanks and everything else just flooding out. And then I'd go the next big river, the Thames River, on my way into the University of Connecticut, be perfectly clear. So it was very interesting to see that this is a great demonstration of what happens when sediment reaches a coastal. This is a rather extreme example of it. Here's the plume coming. This is the jetty that comes out from the mouth of the Connecticut River right here. And this is an aerial photograph. Here's the mouth of the Connecticut River. And here's this plume. And it's interesting because there are faculty at Wesleyan University now that are studying this to see, I mean, in terms of a disturbance, this has got to be fascinating to understand what all came down and how is that impacting the environments that sediment settled onto. So if we looked at all of the different types of things that can make it into Long Island Sound, and particularly nitrogen, because nitrogen, as I'll explain, is the thing that we were tracking the most because it has great importance to the life in Long Island Sound. And to be perfectly honest, the lion's share of the contribution of nitrogen that's making it into Long Island Sound is coming from human waste. Having said that, there have been some really great improvements. A lot of work has been put into improving and cleaning up what's coming out of these facilities. There's great hope in that realm. And if we looked at other, maybe less well understood, mostly because we can't see it, atmospheric nitrogen, all the automobiles that are a part of that 23 million people who are living within 50 miles of Long Island Sound are contributing nitrogen to the atmosphere. It rains, and that becomes part of what rains onto our ground. Agriculture, although at least in Connecticut, agriculture, although it is making a modest comeback, it is not anywhere near what it used to be historically. And I think we can all understand that fecal coliform is a part of what is contributed by our pets. A lot of this is, again, out of sight, out of mind. Storm drains, it's a type of remediation. Everything that goes off of this lawn, off of this street, any of these contributions can go into this grate. There's a certain amount of separation of solids that happens there, but generally speaking, these things discharge directly into a receiving water body, and along the coast, that's Long Island Sound. So there's really not a lot of treatment, certainly not of nitrogen, certainly not of pharmaceuticals or chemicals that are coming from our stormwater. The only thing that's being really trapped in this is solids, suspended solids. So the issue, and the one that I'm really going to focus on, because there's a certain amount of option to this, less so of an option than some of these others, is going to be the nitrogen that we put onto our lawns. And the consequence, of course, is that we see impacts, not just dead fish, which is probably one of the more obvious, but increasing nuisance species, algae blooms, which we've seen more of, and the increasing, was it shellfish poisoning, paralytic shellfish poisoning that happened in the north shore of Long Island in 2013, I believe it was, which was the first ever closing of a shellfish bed because of increased nutrients, and which fed algae. So here's the story, and you've probably all heard about hypoxia. It's also known as the dead zone. And this is actually how it happens. Nitrogen. Very important plant nutrient, by the way. We all know that we feed nitrogen to our plants. But nitrogen in excess amounts that comes from sewage and comes from land use, from stormwater, it's easily soluble in water, so it can travel very quickly and easily from on land to places like Long Island Sound. It enters Long Island Sound in stormwater runoff, and immediately algae start to consume it. It is food for algae. So you can see algae blooms as a result of, after a storm event, for example, large inputs of nitrogen and the consequent blooming of algae. Eventually, the source of nitrogen will be used up by the algae, and that's this pulse. You get a storm, a lot of nitrogen goes into Long Island Sound, and the algae consume it, and then it's gone, and the algae die. This is where we start with the loss of oxygen. So once the algae die, they trickle to the bottom, and that's where the bacteria decompose the algae. And in the process of doing that, they consume oxygen. So they're taking oxygen out of the water to consume the bodies of the algae, which is good for them, but not good for anything else that's down there and that needs that oxygen. Most life needs oxygen. Certain bacteria have the ability to live in low or no oxygen environments. So low oxygen is hypoxia, or no oxygen is anoxia, and we get to both of those states, particularly in the Western Sound where we are right now, as a result of this process. Okay, so let's look at the relationship. And I might want to add, remember the anemone, that nice looking anemone? If you look at those organisms that can escape low or no oxygen. If you're a fish, you can swim away. If you're a lobster, you can move away as long as you're moving in the right direction. If you are that anemone, which is fixed at the bottom, you can't escape low oxygen. This is where we start seeing declines in the web of life, because everything is connected in nature. So even the loss of anemones is breaking down some part of a relationship that needs to be integrated and work. So that becomes the problem. And even a recent study that was done last year, 2013, in the Neuse River in North Carolina, looked at what happens when fish escape. So a fish, you might think, well, what's the problem? There's no low oxygen. The fish will just move out, and then when the oxygen comes back, the fish will come. But this study looked specifically at what happens when you get crowding of fish that leave this low or no oxygen area. They'll move out to waters that have the oxygen, but you've already got a fish population out there. So you get more fish crowding, and you end up with starved or low weight fish as a result of too many fish trying to get at resources that are limited. So here we have lawns. Turf cover, turf grasses, an estimated 50 million acres across the United States. That's about the size of the New England states, if you can think of a lawn that big. 75% of that's in residential lawns. That's important because we tend to really focus on our lawns in terms of nutrient inputs. And the process is not stopping. Each year we're contributing more and more to that. So that's just straight development. Houses come with lawns. So I wanted to take a moment to just talk a bit about how did we get here? How did we get to this kind of default landscape, which is you can't buy a house now without having a lawn. If you buy a new house, it's going to have a lawn. So here's some of our history of this. And as I mentioned, it's fascinating. There's some really great books that have been written about this. Okay, I think we all get the idea of European origins. Castle, we all can think of a castle with a large expanse. And in the case of the castle, that was often kept clear because of the need to look at approaching visitors, both good and bad. They were maintained often by sheep. Makes it a lot easier. We don't have sheep. Then we get our early US presidents who were very influential. If you look at both Jefferson's Monticello and Washington's Mount Vernon, big lawns. They also used sheep, by the way. So there was a little bit a different approach. But it's kind of interesting that a country that had its beginnings in trying to leave this kind of feudal example, ended up creating, you know, these large estates for our early presidents that included this lawn. This is where it really got interesting, though. And this was anywhere from, basically in the 1800s, the union of three very important organizations. The first was President Lincoln created the land grant colleges and the extension system. He also created the USDA, the Department of Agriculture. And most of the early posters that you see of USDA were, and I think most of us would think, were focusing on agricultural issues and a country needing to understand farming and farming practices and produce food for its nation. But by 1924, they had expanded their purview to include suburban lawns and golf areas, golf, turf problems. And that was the result of a couple of other things that happened, which was the United States Golf Association. So by the late 1800s, there were fewer than a dozen golfers. By 1975, and who knows where it is today, 14 million players on 11,000 courses. So, and here's our first golf president. This is President Woodrow Wilson in 1916 playing golf. There were photographs of him playing golf. And this was my grandfather's era, and he was smitten by golf as well. And his retirement was to buy a farm in New Hampshire, and he built a golf course because he was passionate about golf. And I think many of his generation were passionate about golf, which didn't extend to my dad. And then the third of this, which is something that you're familiar with, which is a very strong organization, the American Garden Club, which was founded in 1913. And I have a quote here: "You, as a reader of Better Homes and Gardens," which, you know, Better Homes and Gardens, I can remember my grandmother giving that to my mother as a gift. That was, you know, the standard place where you read about Better Homes and Gardens. So you are an apostle of beauty, and you are able to carry the message to the unconverted. Every street in every city must be beautiful before we can say that we live in a beautiful America. But that was a very genuine, sincere effort to play up the idea of America as a garden. That was a really strong message. And there was a lot of emphasis. There was a exposition in Philadelphia during these years. There was the Chicago World's Fair. There was Frederick Law Olmsted, who contributed significantly to, and in fact created some of the very early residential neighborhoods. So it wasn't just one house. It was actually neighborhoods where lawns were a part of that. So this whole idea of the pastoral, open trees, no fences, whereas historically, before we really put an emphasis on that, there were no yards. I mean, you think of early America where there were chickens. There might have been a small cottage garden for herbs for the kitchen, but beyond that, there was no effort to put something as difficult to maintain as grass and maintain it. The Garden Club also had a very strict idea in the early 1900s about what a lawn had to look like. It should be 1.5 inches high, it should be an even green, it should have no weeds in it, and it should be edged. Very interesting. What's even more interesting is that this is really a whole Northeastern concern. The whole effort to continue the idea of lawns as being important to America, this idea of America as the garden, really started in New York and Connecticut. In fact, the first 3 patents for lawn machines, lawn mowers, and if you take a look at this new modern land mower, Brooms Bushnell Park, just in Hartford in 1912, look at the size of this thing. So here we have, one from Hartford, and this is from Newburgh, New York. And this incredible statistic, which 50,000 lawnmowers a year were being shipped to every country on the globe from right around here. So we really were a big part of this whole idea of lawns and landscapes and maintaining them. It was a part of being American. It was a part of this emerging country and the want to feel prosperous, and also a certain amount of conformity. Nothing got to be more conforming, though, than this. And we probably all know about, the potato fields in western end of Long Island that were converted into these communities that really began the American suburb. This was William Levitt and his sons who built, almost 200,000 homes in a fairly short period of time in New Jersey. Even in Puerto Rico, they had a project. And one of the models area that was opened up in New Jersey, when they opened it, one of the statistics was that they had 30,000 people go through in one weekend looking at these houses. So this had never been done at this scale, and had never been done with sort of this instant, you get a house and you get a lawn. And they were very strict about, in the literature, they would put out newsletters, and in those newsletters it was very clear that you couldn't fence in, you had to maintain your lawn. So not only was it that your house came with a lawn, but it came with the expectation that you were going to maintain that lawn. So now we're starting to see some of the social pressures, which is interesting because in my own small neighborhood where I live in Old Saybrook, which has only got like 6 houses on it, I too feel that pressure. I don't mind the backyard, I can do whatever I want, I have no lawn other than trails, but in the front, I myself have felt this odd, undefined, I can't just convert my front yard into a garden because I'm very aware of the fact that my neighbors, it's property values, it's fitting in with your community, it's very interesting stuff. So the other thing that's interesting about this is this is all happening now. We have returning GIs from World War II. They've been trained in neatness and conformity. They were calling it the conformist 50s. So people came home and they wanted to have families. This was ideal because you had sort of instant communities. And there's also a lot of the interesting things about, World War II changed the way we do a lot of things. And one of that was with pesticides. Pesticides and inorganic fertilizer. Before World War II, we had a pretty straightforward way of fertilizing. Use animal waste, spread it on the fields, and that was, for better or for worse, that was a way to introduce nutrients to continue gardening. Once we had World War II, we had a new technique that using salts could generate inorganic nitrogen. It was inexpensive. You didn't have to go out in the field and spread manure. It broke down readily. Miracle-Gro is a perfect example of our understanding of generation of inorganic and inexpensive fertilizer. So in its day, it was fabulous. This is what was going to feed the world, was this idea that we had inexpensive nutrients. And we also had new chemicals as a result of World War II. This is when DDT, chloridane, I can remember my dad having chloridane and using it to try to get rid of moles. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't so long ago that it was off EPA's list by then, but it was one of those things that he had in his garage forever. But the whole idea was, even some of the literature, if you look back at this time, it was associating, DDT was the atomic bomb of insects, for insects. This whole idea that you were relating it to, we've just come through a war and we're going to attack everything. And the other thing that's interesting about this is that people bought products off their shelves assuming that if it was available, then it was safe. Mm-hmm. And that's a very, we look at that now and say, wow, how could we have done that? And yet, it was very much a part of that time in history. And it was a result, in large part, to what came out of World War II. So, we have an American icon. We also have an issue of nutrient pollution that doesn't have to be there. And what I'd like to do is walk through some of the ideas that you can adopt all of them, that would be great. You can adopt some of them. It's just the idea of how are we going to look at this issue. This is a building right up the Connecticut River, right around the corner. So we're going to look at sound environmental choices. What could we do to reduce the total amount of nitrogen fertilizer that we're using? Do we need all the nitrogen fertilizer that we're using? The answer is maybe more complicated than you want, but feeding the soil is a really great alternative to feeding the plants, because the soil is a really integral part to how plants receive nutrients. And there's a whole suite of organisms that live in the soil. We know so little of them. Earthworms, snails, slugs, okay, so we know some of those. But where the energy is really being recycled is at a much smaller scale, at this scale, where you're looking at microbes. We've got fungi, we've got algae, we've got these little guys up here, nematodes. You can see nematodes about the width of a hair, human hair. So if you put over a rock in your soil, you might just see some of those. And fungi, which is in a good garden, this is a forest soil, where you can just put your fingers in there and you see all this white. That's all fungi, which is all this incredible relationship. And we know so much more now about soil than we did 10 years ago. And we're continuing to study and understand that if you have a healthy, happy soil that's got the right amount of organic material, not too much, not too little, that your plants are going to be so much better off. So, related to that, here are some things that might be surprising. Compaction, okay, if you have a pathway in your lawn where everybody walks, chances are pretty good that that's where you also are seeing weeds come in. Weeds that are particularly good, like plantain, weeds that can take compacted soil. But compaction, pesticides, fungicides, which are addressing specifically fungi, inorganic fertilizers because they are salt-based, they're not organic, and rototilling. Who knew? I had my grandfather's rototiller for years, and that was kind of like the rite of spring. You go out with a rototiller and rototill up your garden. Well, our understanding of soil, particularly soil fungi, because soil fungi plays a really important role in gathering resources outside of the root system of our trees and our plants at great distance. There's a great book, by the way, it's called Teeming with Microbes, if you want to know about this. It's really well written, great book.
What is it called?
Teeming with Microbes. Highly recommended. Anyway, all of these things here destroy beneficial soil organisms. Soil fungi, but also anything. And you can, it makes sense, you're chopping it all up, you're breaking it apart, and that is breaking down. And that is actually consistent with how we're looking at large-scale agriculture now. We're doing no-till agriculture, which is we're putting a slit in the ground and putting the seed in. We're not tearing up the whole system. So we're kind of behind in our own backyards in terms of how agriculture has already looked at this issue. So what about fertilizer? I have some information in the back, by the way, that's called Making a Difference. And a lot of this information I gleaned from a really great report that was done at the University of Connecticut. That was all the New England states, the land-grant colleges got together and studied and put together recommendations for nitrogen inputs that were specifically addressing water quality. So it's great. But if you don't want to read the whole report, which is a little tedious, the thing that I have in the back there is kind of gleaned those things. So the only way to really know how much you need is to get a soil test. It's a tough sell, I know, because soil test takes time and we like instant results, especially in the spring when you've been in winter, all winter. The first thing you want to do is go out there and get things to green up. But a soil test is really the only way that you actually will know how much, if you've got too much, if your soil has an imbalance, and if you need to address that. There are other ways that nitrogen is getting to your soil without doing anything. One of them is atmospheric. So that's an air quality issue, in part from our automobiles, but it has, wind travels from great distances. So the nitrogen that we're getting raining down onto our landscape or coming in rain is adding nitrogen to our lawns. If you leave your lawn clippings, which is a recommended thing to do, don't pack your clippings and take them to the town dump, which creates a solid waste issue there. Leave them on. That adds organic material and it also adds nitrogen. It's a good idea. Corn gluten, which is becoming increasingly popular to use as a control for grubs, but it's also a source of nitrogen. So if you're doing either of those things, you probably don't need to be putting as much, and particularly not according to the package instructions, and particularly if you're using a 4-in-1 product that tells you it's spring, you should be doing this, it's almost summer, you should be doing this, it's summer, you should be doing this, it's fall, you should be doing that. Those are designed to be a one-fix fits all, which is to say they're trying to look at the average of everybody's lawn and say, this is how much fertilizer we think, this is how much pesticides or fungicides we think. If you have to put any of those things down, do them as a spot application, because your whole lawn doesn't need them. This is the general recommendation that's coming from land-grant colleges. Apply 1/2 to 1/3 less fertilizer that's being recommended, and that should be about 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet if your lawn is older than 10 years old, because there's a difference. An older lawn has had time to develop its soil, and so it doesn't need as much food. If you've got a new lawn, less than 10 years old, up to 3 pounds. There's a particular time, twice a year, if you need it. That's where the soil test is so good. Because the soil test may be telling you don't really need to add anything. But if you're going to do it, the best one time to do it is mid-September to mid-October. I just met this past week with Carl Gallard at the University of Connecticut, who has studied this sort of thing for 20 years. And he said it makes him very nervous to tell people mid-September to mid-October, because the whole idea of doing that is that that's the time that's most like spring, but it has less of the issues of rain and moisture and competing with fungi and that sort of thing. And yet, if the season doesn't go well, if you end up with a really rainy fall, which we didn't this fall, but it does happen, then if people are all putting their fertilizer down, the chances are pretty good that that's going to be leached or it's going to go off the surface of the land. So this makes him nervous, which makes me nervous. So the whole idea is really the best thing you can do is get a soil test. Slow release fertilizers. I'd be the first to tell you, as many people who advise on this, that too much fertilizer is too much fertilizer, whether it's organic or inorganic. So you can pollute with pollute with organic fertilizer just as much as you can with inorganic fertilizer. So the idea is to not put too much. But the advantage of a slow release as opposed to a quick release, the quick release will have instant results. You'll see greening up. The problem with a quick release is that the plant can only use so much over a given period of time, and as soon as it has used everything that it needs, the rest of that just goes instantly water soluble. Remember, it goes instantly either into the soil or off the surface of the land into Long Island Sound. Either way, either through the water table or through land surface. But the advantages of slow release: longer response time, so you don't have to use it as often. It has low potential for leaching because, remember, the soil organisms are incorporating it into their bodies. That's what this Teeming with Microbes book will tell you, is that it's the soil microorganisms that are holding those nutrients like little fertilizer bags. And it's not until they are predated by the next level up in that soil that that actually becomes released. So it's a slow release. It's the way nature does it. Less potential for going into the air, less potential for burning roots. So again, it all gets back to these soil microbes. If you have a happy soil, you've got happy plants. You can add compost, but I have Tom Morris come from the University of Connecticut to the Coastal Certificate to talk about that it is possible to use too much compost. You can actually pollute with too much compost, which is different than what a lot of organic organizations will talk about, which is you can use compost as much as you want. This may be a tough sell, but consider reducing your lawn area. Consider reducing your lawn area for wildlife habitat. Here's some examples in the Connecticut River Valley. Here's lawn, maintained lawn with their shrubs. Here is the Connecticut River, and they have simply let natural vegetation. Here's another one that I particularly like because they have also zigzagged their dock so that as opposed to putting it straight down the hill, which as soon as it rains, even on the dock, the water will go straight down. So using this kind of angled is a much better way to do it. But some people object to the look of this, but this is fabulous habitat. And we have so many great examples in nature of plants that can be applied to our landscaping, native landscaping. Another tough sell, and I'll go through this quickly, but an untidy garden, if you leave over the winter, for example, the flower heads, this is where not only will birds be able to get this through the winter, our winter resident birds, but things like praying mantis eggs, which if you take all these things down, and clean out and tidy up your garden, you may also be losing some of the beneficial organisms that are part of a healthy garden. It also provides substantial natural sources of food. Here's my liatris and sedum that the birds, this was, I think it was last winter when we had so much snow, that birds really need that, and just the protective area of kind of messy landscape. The other thing you can do is soften your hardscape. The whole idea behind this is that happy microorganisms in the soil also do a fabulous job of remediating toxins, pollutants, all sorts of things that we don't want to get into Long Island Sound. And so by not having an impervious surface, your driveway, for example, maybe put partially impervious and then leave this so that water can get through. There's all kinds of opportunities. There's the old school, and then there's the new school of pavers that you can use. There's all different ways, some creative ways. This is in Newport, Rhode Island, which I thought was really attractive. This idea that you don't need to have a gutter. You can let the water come off and splash. Of course, some of that depends on where your foundation is. And even rain gardens, which is taking water from your downspout from the roof and feeding the garden with it. There are many creative ways. This is becoming a really important part of low-impact development. Reduce the need for fertilizer by using native plants. Right plant, right place. This is, nature knows what to do. Seaside goldenrod is a really good example of this. A plant that grows naturally under very harsh conditions, salt, wind, rain, and is an amazing pollinator. And that's the other part of the conversion to native plants, because we all know with the decline of colony collapse disorder that the loss of our bee population and solitary bees, there's a whole slew of insects that are important for pollination. A lawn is not providing any of the resources that are needed by these pollinators. And part of that is because the relationship between native plants and other species, such as pollinators, has been set for many thousands of years in some cases. And so who are we to come and introduce plants that are coming from China or from other parts of the world that may not be providing the resources that are important? And here's a really nice example of this. Cultivated varieties of plants may actually be breeding out of a plant some of the important characteristics that plant provides for pollinators. Here's an example of, we can't see, this is ultraviolet light. So here's a dandelion, here's the ultraviolet indicators that helps the pollinator hone in on the part of the flower that it needs in order to get the nutrients that it needs. And if we do cultivated varieties, we may actually be taking out some of these characteristics unknowingly. Resist a knee-jerk reaction to insects. I know that's harder for some people than for others, and particularly if you have any kind of response to a bee sting, but they really are incredibly important. Another book that I'd recommend, if you haven't already read it, is Doug Ptolemy's Bringing Nature Home, which is a great, he's an entomologist, so he really gets into the discussion about the important role that insects play, not just bees, but insects in general, in keeping healthy natural communities. And if you haven't heard of neonicotinoids, the chances are you will, because this is like the DDT of our time. This is what people are starting to link to this colony collapse disorder, even though colony collapse disorder appears to be multiple things just coming into sort of the perfect storm for our pollinators. But neonicotinoids are incredibly dangerous, particularly to bees. And the problem is that, I took this photograph at a local hardware store. Anybody can go in here and take a bottle off the shelf, and you could pour that whole thing onto a plant. It's not regulated. I know, wouldn't that be awful? But the whole idea is that nobody's regulating that. So, we have garden products that we are putting, farmers are regulated. They can't do that kind of thing. So when they're putting pesticides and herbicides on, they're doing it strictly regulated. There are some alternatives, like applying them to non-flowering plants or after the plants have bloomed. But getting that information to people who are using these products is a hard thing to do. And finally, if you live near a stream or a water body or Long Island Sound, consider creating a vegetative buffer, because plants do an amazing job of remediating all of the nutrients, excess nutrients, toxins. They incorporate it into their biomass, or they slow it down in order for these soil organisms to break it down, or they incorporate it into their plant material, all of which locks it and keeps it out of our water systems, either groundwater or surface water. And even a modest buffer can make a difference. Doesn't mean you have to have 300 feet. Here's a picture on the Connecticut coast, I thought that was interesting, of houses that are way too close for climate change. But see where these people have left the vegetation here, cleared a little bit of vegetation here. So it's amazing how, again, this gets into that whole community-based idea that, you can look at where can you make a difference. Here's a native wetland buffer, not very far from me. This is in a tidal area on the Connecticut River. The color on this is way off. But this is a eupatorium, so it's like the reds are gone. This is jopai weed and aster and sneezeweed, selenium. That's all just hanging out there. Those are very durable plants. In the winter, they'll get ice scour, and in flood times, they'll be underwater. These plants are such a great example of the lessons that we can take from native landscapes to create designs that are good for nature and for water. So in conclusion, sound gardening, it benefits all kinds of life forms. It benefits those organisms that are living in Long Island Sound, but it also, has a whole suite of people, including an up-and-coming generation who will be the future stewards of Long Island Sound and those parts. We have a lot of reasons to be thinking about how can we, in our own landscapes, make the difference that collectively could make a difference to Long Island Sound. If you are interested, visit Sound Gardening. It's the longislandsoundstudy.net. There's literature at the table at the back there. I put together a lot of information over time. I need to update it, but it's still sound information along this topic. And either one of these sites, longislandsoundstudy.net or Sea Grant at UConn, you can find information and you can contact me if you have any questions. The only other thing that I would say is there's some literature in the back, and of course Nancy and Ernie, is that right? Yeah. There's a new comprehensive conservation and management plan that's in the works, that is close to maybe coming to a final document. The public comment period, I believe, is over. Is that correct, Nancy?
I think we extended it.
It has been extended.
I think you can still.
Well, I think the point is, this is a great document. This is a shortened, much shortened version of, it's great. It talks about what has been accomplished and where do we need to go in the future in 4 different categories that we're going to be focused on with the comprehensive management plan. So if you have an interest, please pick this up because it'll tell you a lot about where the future direction of Long Island Sound wants to go with the Long Island Sound study. I should mention also that Nancy Selig's, in addition to being a supervisor, is also the co-chair for the Citizens Advisory Committee for Long Island Sound study, which is a huge job. And if you have any questions in that realm, I'm sure Nancy would be happy to talk to you about that. So plenty of literature, and I would be happy to answer any questions. Yes?
I have a couple of very low-key, basic questions. I'm a phonetic composter, and I'm wondering, some things that, should I put weeds in my compost, or should I put them out in bags to go to elsewhere so that I don't have weeds in my compost?
It all depends on how hot your compost is getting.
Okay.
So if you are, and you can tell, you don't
Okay.
have to use a thermostat or a thermometer,
Mhm.
but if you're able to produce a black, pretty dark, where you can't really identify individual pieces, then it's hot enough to take care of your weed seeds.
And how about the, what, increasing numbers of dry cleaners are returning our clothes in, quote, biodegradable green plastic. And they say, you know, you could just put that, it won't fill your landfills. And
You know, I for a number of years, I have been putting, because you know, they have utensils that are supposedly biodegradable, and even little hangers that are supposed to be biodegradable, and I put them in my compost, and every year I turn them, and there they are, yep. So they don't seem to be breaking down. Now, it may be, I think some of those recommendations are industrial composting, like our town does composting, and they get really hot. You can see the steam. I don't,
Yes.
my compost never gets that hot. So maybe if it's hot enough, those things will break down. I don't know. I have a lot of issues with plastics in general.
And how about wood ashes, so that
You can use wood ashes, you just don't want to use them in high concentrations because they have a lot of lye in them, so it's a real jolt to the organic, the microorganisms in your compost pile. So I spread mine, I just spread them out a lot, and if I have a lot in the winter, I just do it in little bits at a time and mix it all in, and it seems to be fine. Yeah, yeah.
I'm a landscape designer and I work with a lot of landscape contractors. And, you know, all these recommendations that you're saying, most people don't take care of their lawns around here. They have companies that do it. And those people make money by selling them services. And even, you know, I've tried to do organic, I try to convince everybody to do organic, but a lot of times people have weeds and we've tried to take care of it organically and it just doesn't work, and they wind up having...
Yeah, that's a huge issue, and some of that is expectations. I mean, because I've talked to people about conversion. First of all, it seems to be more of a, I don't know how many times I've given a talk, and the women in the audience will say, pardon me men, but the women will say, it's not me, it's my husband. This is his realm, and he will not listen to anything.
It's men.
So some of that is that may be a cultural.
It is, it's cultural.
Yeah.
It's some kind of control thing.
But, or time out of the, I don't know. But in the back, there's some literature about a program that the Connecticut NOFA, which is the Northeast Organic Farmers Association, has started a program, modest. It's being funded by Long Island Sound Futures funds to create a one-day organic certification program for the people who run lawn businesses. And part of what we're also looking at through the CCMP process, through rewriting the plan, is to try to get some Spanish translations, because I've given talks where people say, you know, I've got people doing my lawns, but the people who show up to actually do the work, they don't speak English and I don't speak Spanish. So there's a lot of issues having to do with exactly what you're saying, and we're aware of them and coming up with some ideas for that. There has been increasing interest in the one-day certification. It's a long day, but we've had some good
Does the
interest.
Landscape and Turf Association promote it as well?
Yeah, that's what I said.
Because that's the place to do it. I
They
will
do and they
contact them.
don't.
Yeah, I'd love to get the information from, what was the organization?
It's called
New York.
the Turf and Landscape
Oh,
Association.
yes, is that the one that has the big conference?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
which I have not gotten to yet.
They
but-
have done some
January.
stuff.
Yeah, I would like to go to that. Yeah, we have a similar version in Connecticut. Yeah.
I asked our landscaper a year or two ago to leave the leaves, but he said that really doesn't work. There are too many leaves, and it would
You know, I
fill
suppose
the
if you have a
grass.
lot of leaves, I always put my leaves into my garden beds, and by spring, they are largely gone. But then I don't have as many, perhaps, trees.
But then
as-
you rake them in there. See, I was there.
Yeah, I just rake them into the garden
Leaf
beds.
blowers, and they take them,
Yeah,
put them by the
but
curb.
I think that you've really got, you know, it is a business, and the more, this is just what Carl Gerard was saying at UConn, is that, you know, the business is to make money, and the more stuff you can put on the lawn and convince the homeowner that they need, the more money you'll make. And there's kind of a disjunct there.
And they're afraid to charge more for leaf mulching. Like, they really should be charging more because it takes longer time. They have a $2,700 machine that is really grinding, and that is a big deterrent for these landscapers to use these leaf mulching because it breaks their machines, it takes a lot longer, and they're afraid their clients won't pay anymore.
Right.
So,
What I'd love to do is I'm starting to try to get the Society of Landscape Architects in Connecticut involved through the Coastal Certificate to try to bring some of these issues in, because
yeah.
landscape designers and architects are very aware of these issues. Yeah.
There is a small movement, but many municipalities, Norshell is quite large, Irvington, and then I believe Greenberg, another very large town. They have the love 'em and leave 'em bans
Yes.
now, or it's a ban
What's it
on picking up
Rubber
leaves.
leaves.
So if you're gonna have a town pick it up, it has to be bagged. And there are a lot of landscape, I'm also in the business, I'm as a landscape designer. And I know a lot of my colleagues have retrofitted their machines, and it does take an investment, but it's a very efficient and it's coming more and more throughout Westchester County. And they actually can pulverize the leaves pretty
Yeah.
much. And then whatever's left that's extra, they can blow it into the beds.
Which is fabulous.
It is fabulous. They just have to get educated and invest, and then more townships have to really kind of, and they are coming, it's slow, but these 3 large towns in Westchester are doing a big impact.
Wow.
Because smaller towns can also reduce their municipality expenses if they don't have to pick up as much.
We have a big, in my community, we have a huge compost facility. So people, there's a collection and all those leaves go, and it's really beautiful stuff except for the bits of plastic that you can find, in everything. But yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
Just wanted to follow up on that because of the New Rochelle change in the law, on their website, they had posted several names of landscapers that would do mulch mowing, and I
Yes.
called the first one on the list, and he actually had never done it before. But he's doing it for me now. He's doing it for me now, and hopefully, I think he underbid, but hopefully it will not have been such a terrible experience, and, who knows, maybe we'll throw a little more money at it.
Well, see, it works at both ends. There's the, if the homeowner demands it, part of what I've got, but I've got it on hold, is trying to come up with recommendations that a homeowner can use when they're looking for a lawn service. I mean, it's difficult because, at least in my neck of the woods, it seems like everybody in the summer has a pickup truck and a lawnmower and a couple rakes, and they're in business, and
It's been
unregulated.
constant negotiating about how, he's trying to figure out how to do it, and also I'm a new client, so, I want to have some compost piles in addition, and where do they
But see,
go and so on, but it's,
you're creating a demand. That's why we're excited about
everybody
this.
usually just does everything
Yeah,
the
this is
same
why we're
way they've
excited
always
about
done it, so.
the training, the organic training for businesses, small businesses.
Yeah,
I figure one day it's
Yeah.
more affordable and they can do it for one day. And we give them the whole 9 yards about soil